and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. So, how many times have you worn that top you bought last month? And how many clothes did you throw away the last time you cleared out your closet? But hey, you did put all that stuff into recycling bins, didn't you? So that's okay? Or is it? Well, to talk more about this, we have Christina Dean here over in London, and here in Taipei, we have Martin Su. Let's head to the UK first. Christina, your organization, I would say, was one of the pioneers in holding big fashion companies to task over waste. Can you tell us more about it and what else you do?
Yes, well, fashion waste is something that we've been involved in very, very passionately for over 16 years. And what we've seen over this period of time is the explosion of fashion consumerism and production. And in that same period of time, we've seen the environmental impact of the fashion industry escalate, so much so that today the fashion industry is thought to contribute 10% of global CO2. And of course, we all know that we're in a climate emergency. And so the fashion industry, the production, us as consumers have a very big role to play in both examining our behavior and also questioning how we're going to change this for the future.
And Martin, you're a very unusual person in your industry. You come from manufacturing, but you're pushing for change from within. Tell us more about that and about your background.
Yeah, sure. I'm from Yicheng. My name is Martin, and we are basically a manufacturer here based in Asia. We work with multiple global brands, basically providing fabric in order to make products. So yeah, basically back in 2019, we started a plan trying to deal with what Christina was talking about, the climate crisis, right? We're part of the 10%. And so what we are trying to do is look into the way we produce, look into the material choice that we make, try to do our part basically within the whole value chain to reduce our impact on various topics of sustainability, whether it's about water, chemical, waste, materials, as well as energy, and try to see what we can adjust from the old-fashioned ways to hopefully to a better one.
Christina, you started your campaign, I would say, more than 10 years ago, way before it was fashionable to be actually tackling fast fashion waste. What was your motivation?
Well, actually, I was working as a journalist writing a lot about environmental issues when I stumbled on the textile industry's impact on the planet and the environment. And it was really starting to understand in 2005, just as what we call the fast fashion industry, this explosion of fashion production was kicking off, that I realized as a journalist doing some deep research that we were overlooking the fact that the textile industry is so polluting. And so I started Redress back in 2007, really to raise awareness of fashion's negative environmental impact. And my motivation for doing that is because ethically, I think that as fashion citizens or as fashion consumers, we have a need to dress, but we also have a responsibility to dress in an ethical, more sustainable way that does not actually really damage the planet, which ultimately damages people's health, people's well-being, and creates a lot of risk to humanity. And so fundamentally, deep down in my heart, my question and my resolve and my why I get up every day and why I'm so motivated on this topic is really a questioning of, is it right to be able to buy, wear, and chuck out our clothes in the way that we do, when ultimately that's causing planetary issues and ultimately that is damaging people's health and well-being? And my answer to that is no.
And Martin, you have quite an interesting narrative too. You came from the environmental side and now you're part of the manufacturing side. Can you tell us your story?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of started more focusing on the waste topic. And most of the time with the nonprofit sector, as you just mentioned, more talking about education, outreach, communication work, try to get people to understand the problem with waste. And later on, that kind of transformed into a larger issue of whole climate change. And that leads to where I'm today, more on the business side, so to speak, and look into what Christina was talking about, the generator of the waste and fabric and pollution, right? So it's interesting, definitely the change of journey and impact. But I think in a way for me, being here, try to address the situation is that it has a lot of opportunity, right? Like if we can actually make it right, to make it in a different way, and potentially even change the business model, the amount of impact is far greater than in a way of what I've been working on in the past per se. Because a lot of times in the past was more indirect, right? We're trying to convince people to change, convince people to do it differently. But now potentially I have it in a position to change myself, right? Change ourselves per se, by working with various partners, brands around the globe, and address a much needed and big issues, which is the fashion industry.
And that takes us to one of the biggest sources of textile waste, fast fashion. In fact, fashion accounts for almost 10% of global carbon emissions, as Christina mentioned. That's more than flying and shipping combined. But why is fast fashion so, well, fashionable? For an insight, we reached out to the former digital editor of the fashion magazine Harper's Bazaar. Here's Celine Xu in Paris.
The reason why fast fashion can grow so fast and become such a popular choice for young people, it's mainly because of its pricing points. Of course, it's lower. And I remember when I was a student back in college and high school, fast fashion is also like my go-to choice when go shopping, because I had limited income. And so it becomes a natural thing that you go for the things that you can afford. But also fast fashion they offer such a variety of options, but also catching the trends at the same time. So I think it's quite natural for young people to shop at the fast fashion brands.
Christina, you've been campaigning for this for more than a decade. Within that time, have you seen much change within the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, and how they view fashion and fashion waste?
Well, it's a very confusing, conflicting answer, actually, because on the surface, we know from research that millennials, Gen Zs, they care much more about the environment, about climate change. We've seen, the climate protesters around the world. We believe that younger generations care much more about the future, and they've grown up seeing the droughts, the floods, the fires, etc. So on the surface, the research suggests that more and more younger consumers really care, and that they are going to change the planet, etc. But that is not really translated into fashion consumption. We're not actually seeing a drop in fashion consumption, particularly fast fashion consumption, off the back of this general environmental awareness. And so to answer the question, we would have to get a little bit more geographically positioned. I think in some markets where fast fashion is more mature, there might be a more developed sense of eco-awareness and sort of anti-fast fashion movement. So by that, I would say in some Western markets, you can see that younger fashion consumers might be walking away from fast fashion and going more towards secondhand, pre-loved, finding a different identity for themselves. And then on the flip side, when you look at emerging markets, which is where we're seeing very radical increases in fast fashion consumption, the idea and the newness of this fast fashion market to the younger generation is still very enticing. In some emerging markets, fast fashion businesses have really only just set up shop. And so that's alluring to those younger generations in those emerging markets who have not yet sort of been through that cycle of awareness that more mature markets may have been through.
Martin, this must be kind of a quandary for you. In a way, the manufacturing industry thrives on increased consumption, but at the same time, one of the answers to reducing waste is to lessen consumption. So is there really incentive in your industry to change practices?
Right, because the way it functions, and I can concur with what both of you just mentioned, right? For us, the past, I would say even pre-pandemic times, every year the production numbers just been going up and up and up. So it's really about the current way of business and the way they set up shop, whether it's in Southeast Asia or like South America, in Africa. All the developing countries are catching up in a whole new trend of fast fashion, and a lot of that relates to the manufacturer side. Like the production side is getting closer to the market, is closer to the consumer, and still about mass production and mass sales. So for us, definitely there's a very clear indication and in action that it's still ongoing. And to change that, it requires a very different kind of mindset and business model.
Yeah, and I think, Martin, I mean, may I just like put some numbers on that, because we do know that fast fashion is going to increase, and it's predicted that within this decade, fast fashion is going to increase by 20%, which is quite a horrific increase if you consider that at the moment we're producing over 100 billion garments every year. So if you just think to the future, for the next 10 years, which is really a critical time, as we know, for the 1.5 degree increase in climate change that we're all fighting against, to see and to have these predictions of a potential 20% increase is mind-bogglingly worrying. And it actually, Martin, to your point, really puts a lot of pressure on the manufacturers to find and implement better practices for clothing production, because we have a real kind of elephant in the room, which is that we are all fashion citizens, we are all human beings. And the reality of human beings is that many people like to shop, they like to change their clothes, they like to feel and look different, they like to consume, it makes them feel good. And that is something that we're not going to change tomorrow. And so therefore, as we have to accept that fashion consumption is going to increase in the future, we have to find sustainable raw materials, we have to find better manufacturing. And so, you know, Martin, your sort of company and your ethics and your, you know, your practices are so critical in being adopted in the mass industry.
Okay, so in that case, Martin, what are some of the practices you are looking at and you're hoping to integrate into manufacturing?
For the raw material side, definitely we're trying to incorporate the concept from the circular economy mindset, right? So whether the material is a biological cycle, like it comes from some kind of plants from Earth, that hopefully we want to make sure that by the end of the product life, so to speak, it will be able to go back to the soil safe and sound. So we are heavily investigating into that routes of material type, whether it's from cotton, from hemp, or other nature fiber that we don't even know of, or not even plants from food waste or agricultural waste, to use those kind of raw material to have a better new source, new raw material compared to the conventional one. So that's one direction. The other direction we're also looking into is from basically the technical cycle side, basically the synthetics, right? The basically plastic. And how can we basically keep that material in our economy as long as possible? So basically making it more durable, making sure that it's not shredding microfiber is another big issue coming up. And also in the end of its life, can we actually take it back and recycle into new raw material for the next batch of production? So that's the other thing that we are looking to try to develop and set out a system for that, to maintain the material within our system without just leakage into the nature environment that's not being recycled.
Look, I'm glad you brought up the whole idea of polyester, a synthetic material. Christina, can you give us a picture of what kind of impact that has on the environment, especially when people wear this very, very cheap material, throw them out very quickly after, many of which don't go into recycling? Tell us what kind of an impact that is having on the environment.
Absolutely. I mean, synthetic fibers have been a sort of jackpot for the fashion industry because they're cheaper than natural fibers. And so by synthetic fibers, we're kind of talking about plastic. You know, 63% of the world's fashion production and clothing, they're actually made out of plastic, synthetic fibers, to sort of summarize it. And the problem with that is actually what happens at home, more so than, you know, the typical consumer understands. And this is it. You buy your plastic clothes, you take them home, you wash, they go around your washing machine, and out comes microfibers from your washing machine. And these are tiny, tiny fibers about the thickness of your hair, a few millimeters long. And they're so small that no filter can get them out. And so basically they enter the sea. So if we look at I think 35% of the plastics that are in the sea are actually coming from the fashion industry. They're coming from mine and your clothes, our plastic clothes that are being washed. And the real problem with that is that these microfibers actually come up the food chain and they come back into fish, and actually they even come back into us. So basically we're in such a situation that we are eating plastic from our own clothes. And this is causing human health and, you know, huge damage to the oceans. And that's just one problem with plastic clothing.
Right, and I want to bring it to another huge issue, which comes at the manufacturing, at the beginning of the life of a piece of clothing, and that's the use of water. Now, it takes staggering amounts of water to produce a single T-shirt. The industry is responsible for over 1/3 of microplastics in the seas, and it uses 4% of all fresh water in the world. So, let's talk about how even at the stage before a piece of clothing is actually manufactured, the amount of resources that go into it. And Martin, can I go to you with this? Are you looking at that, starting from there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's definitely something that you will come across if you ever go to a factory. That's a big part, right? Like, it's a lot of water that needs to be input into the system in order to basically put color on your fabric. That's part of the conventional ways of doing the business. And what comes off on that, it's also wastewater that you need to deal with and make sure it's like okay to be disposed later on. But over the whole process, the amount of water you need, it's ridiculous. I mean, like, you just show the numbers, right? So like whether it's you're talking about diamond, whether you're talking about T-shirts, whether you're talking about jackets, and a lot of our cases in shoes, it's all the same story. It requires a tremendous amount of water in and out. And for us, trying to reduce that has been a big issue. And try to look into different various, whether it's conventional ways, but tweaking the parts of the production to make it more efficient to reduce water usage. Or for me and long term, we are looking into new machinery or new techniques of coloration that requires little to no water, right? Because that's kind of what we think needs to happen. Right? Eventually, what we really need is the color. We don't need the water. But why do we need so much water? It's all because it's based on new ways of processing and chemicals that rely on water as a medium to put color on fabrics. But can we do it without the water? Absolutely. But it definitely requires more research and more time and cost potentially, and also even business model to produce that kind of fabric for the fashion industry.
But Martin, I'd also add to that, if I may, what you've described is the water that's within the factory walls or underneath the roof of the factory. And Divya, some of the stats you were using on water and fashion, we have to remember that the growing of the crops, the cotton, is extremely water intense. So way before those fibers and fabrics reaches Martin's factory, we're seeing tremendous amounts of water being used for irrigation for cotton, for example. And we've got this really fundamentally, it feels, wrong system of agriculture where a lot of cotton is grown in countries that don't have much water. And this is, a staggering impact. This has a staggering impact on the communities that live in these countries, because not only is there water being used for cotton, but it's also being polluted by pesticides. And so, when we think about fashion wastage, we have to think about all of the resources that went into those materials that are essentially being discarded with tremendous negative impact.
So, Christina, then in that case, let me bring it into what the EU is trying to do in this case. And I think we've had a conversation about this before, the whole idea of this EU legislation, EPR, which is targeting manufacturers. What kind of impact do you hope that will have? And can you give us a bit of background in a nutshell of what that is trying to do?
Well, first of all, the European Commission last year issued a sustainable textiles and circular textiles recommendation. And within this report, the EU has recommended the best practice for all types of more circular, more sustainable textiles and apparel. One of their recommendations within many is the concept of an extender producer responsibility on EPR. And basically, that's a taxation or a levy on the producer, for this instance it would be the brand, to create a sort of a penalty, really, in order that the brand or the producer takes responsibility for the cost of dealing with their waste. So what that would mean, if it were enacted, is that fashion brands would have to pay a levy per garment, which would raise money to help with the cost of dealing with their waste. And we've seen the EPR concept put into practice in different industries like the car tire industry. So this is not new, it's just that it has not yet, if at all, been implemented in fashion. And you can argue that actually fashion retailers and brands are getting away with churning out a lot of product, They're making a lot of money. And who is paying for this mess? The rest of the world. You know, governments are spending a huge amount in terms of collecting, sorting, and trying to recycle clothing. Landfills are getting fuller and fuller with clothing waste. And so there is a big push to say, actually, the producer ought to be taking more responsibility for the cost of clearing up the costs of their low sort of quality, fast product.
Right, Martin, what do you make of that? And do you think that's something that would be well received if that were enacted here?
Well, I mean, we actually read the report as well. we will also look into the whole policy change. And to be honest, for us, I think it's a good thing, because we are wanting to have some kind of advantage based on our desire to be more sustainable in our manufacturing processes, right? But at this point, without such kind of policy and change, we're actually losing money to do the right thing. We're actually paying more to do the right thing because it costs us more. But if there's some kind of regulation and policy support us by doing the, you know, whether it's about like reduce use of water, reduce use of fossil fuel energy, be responsible for our waste that we need to recycle, take back, what have you, it's actually better. That means that all the investment and system that we set up to have that is a new way of producing, like I was mentioned earlier, about coloration, it will make sense. But in the current ways of a linear system, it does not, because we're actually paying more to have a better system. So in our eye, specifically for us, we see that as a good thing. That's the whole reason why we are looking forward to or investing into this sector, because we believe, yes, it's the right thing to do, but it's also our competitive advantage, right? If we were to stay in the business for monetary reasons, but also for sustainability reasons, this is the way to go. And with policy like that from the EU will only help us.
And so I think, Divya, Divya, I was just going to say how interesting, Martin, your point of view is on that, because, you know, businesses like Martin's, who are already like way ahead of the game in terms of the investment that you clearly have put into your sustainable practices, this type of legislation is giving you an absolute leg up because you're ahead of the curve. I can tell you, though, that of many manufacturers I've spoken to over the last year about this new EU legislation, many of them don't know it's coming. They don't know the ramifications that it will have on their business. And so, you know, obviously you're very forward thinking, which is to be commended. And I would just add that a number of Asian manufacturers have got no clue that this is coming, and that will essentially smack them in the face quite hard if and as and when these changes are actually enacted into policy.
You know, Christina, I was going to ask you how, I mean, someone like Martin, you won't have to lobby very much, but I was going to ask you how much effort it takes for you to lobby manufacturers in changing their practices, but you somehow have already kind of answered that. I want to talk to ask Martin then, how much effort or how much of a feat is it going to be to convince other manufacturers, particularly in this part of the world, as Christina pointed out, to have more sustainable practices?
You know, because for us, we've been trying to have different kind of projects and proposal with the brand partner that we work with. And a lot of times, one of the key things we told them is that we are ready to do some change. We're willing to make something different in a different process, but we do need some market for it, right? We need some incentive to do so. A lot of times, back in the days, or even till now, a lot of this sustainability, whether it's regulations, new policy, new rules, it's all based on punishment. It's that we have this goal to reach. If you don't, you know, has a certain amount of, let's say, chemicals out from your wastewater, then you'll be punished. You're being like scolded at. But what, in a way, I think what incentivize the industry to change for the better is that you incentivize them, right? Like if you say that you use a certain amount of X energy from renewable source, you'll get more benefits. You'll get like, I don't know, a higher price for your order. You get more order, something like that, kind of like a carrot and stick situation. For now, it's mostly the stick. But I think if there are more and more carrots within the business relation structure between brands and manufacturer, it will incentivize us to do more of the good thing. Like I said earlier, I feel up to this point, we are basically paying to be better, right? But what if you get paid to be better? That's a totally situation mentality that will help a manufacturer like us to be willing to improve and feel good about doing that. Right,
we're coming up to the end of this episode, but before we go, I want to get you to listen in on someone that, Christina, you might find familiar. And one person who doesn't need convincing is Jessica Chang. She's a young Taiwanese designer. She was featured at this year's Taipei Fashion Week. We went to her studio to find out why she created her brand PCES based on sustainability.
Why I decided to go into sustainability in general, I just feel like in the past, when I was younger, I didn't think of this at all. And when I look at my designs, there's an emptiness that I feel that like these are just pretty clothings and there's not really a lot of meaning behind it. It doesn't really contribute anything. And that gave me a lot of sadness, especially when I look at my peers that's actually doing something that contributes, that has an impact. And for me, that's very self-fulfilling to do something that has to do with sustainability.
Well, we'll hear more from Jessica and our guests, Christina Dean, Martin Su, in the next episode of Connected. But this is where we say goodbye to our viewers. Thank you for watching and stay connected.